October 3, 1942, Peenemünde, on the Baltic coast. The air is sharp with salt and early autumn cold, and the wind moves in hard, rhythmic gusts across flat sand and scrub pine. Floodlights cut pale corridors through the dusk. Somewhere beyond the dunes, the sea keeps its own steady tempo, but on the range, the dominant sound is mechanical. Generators, shouted measurements, the clank of ladders, the dry metallic tap of tools against a skin of riveted steel. A tall, slender rocket, 14 meters of ambition, stands on its pad like a matched candle, waiting for a hand that will never come. In the final moments before ignition, the atmosphere is neither triumph nor fear, but concentration, the kind of silence that exists only when men believe history is about to obey them. When the engine finally lights, the exhaust is not merely flame, it is a violent white-hot storm, and the rocket rises with a roar that seems to tear a seam in the sky. That night, Major General Walter Dornberger would mark the occasion with a sentence meant to sound like destiny. This third day of October 1942 is the first of a new era in transportation, that of space travel. It mattered because Germany, by 1942, was already beginning to feel the limits of conquest. The early war had rewarded speed, armored columns, concentrated air power, operational surprise, and the Reich's leadership had learned to treat technological daring as a substitute for time, manpower, and material depth. But wars of industry are not decided by the elegance of a prototype. They are decided by production lines, oil, transport networks, trained crews, and the ability to absorb losses without breaking. As Allied air power grew and the strategic bombing campaign tightened, German planners sought a lever that could pry open the future, something that could bypass the bomber streams and the convoy routes, and the grinding arithmetic of attrition. In that search, the phrase secret weapon became more than propaganda. It became a kind of prayer, a belief that the right device, delivered at the right moment, could restore control over events that were slipping away. The expectation inside many German formations, especially among those closest to the new weapons, was not simply that these machines would win battles. It was that they would restore the sensation of superiority. New weapons promised a return to an earlier emotional climate, the confident spring of 1940, when the enemy seemed perpetually unready, perpetually late, perpetually surprised. For a Luftwaffe pilot watching Allied bomber formations thicken over Germany, or an engineer watching reports of cities burned and rail yards shattered, the dream of a wonder weapon was a dream of reversing humiliation, of making the enemy taste helplessness. Yet the lived experience of the men who built and fielded these systems was often the opposite: secrecy that isolated them, scarcity that throttled them, and a collapsing state that demanded miracles while stripping away the very resources required to produce them. The V-2, known during development as the A-4, was the most radical of these wagers. In physical terms, it was a tall, finned cylinder, 14 meters long, 1.65 meters in diameter, with a wingspan across its fins of 3.56 meters and a launch mass around 12,500 kilograms. Its warhead weighed about 1,000 kilograms. Its operational range was roughly 320 kilometers. On a long-range trajectory, it could climb to about 88 kilometers, and under certain vertical launch profiles, even higher. It could reach extreme speeds. Figures commonly cited include a maximum around 5,760 kilometers per hour, with impact speeds around 2,880 kilometers per hour, making interception essentially impossible for wartime defenses designed for aircraft. Over 3,000 were built, and about 3,225 were launched in combat. The numbers themselves feel modern, a supersonic ballistic missile used against cities in the 1940s, an object that arrived faster than warning and struck before sound could follow it. In the minds of many Germans, that speed carried moral meaning. If a weapon could not be stopped, then perhaps it could force political outcomes. The V2 was framed as retribution, Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapon, an answer to bombing raids, an instrument that would break civilian morale in Britain and Belgium. But the reality of the V2 campaign was double-edged. The rocket did kill. London alone is often cited with an estimated 2,754 civilians killed and 6,523 injured by V2 attacks. Antwerp and its region suffered devastating casualties as well, including figures such as 1,736 dead and 4,500 injured in Greater Antwerp attributed to V2 strikes. And yet, in the cold logic of strategy, the weapon could not deliver what its believers wanted most: control. It was inaccurate by the standards required for decisive military targets, expensive in scarce materials, and deployed too late to alter the industrial imbalance. Even one accessible summary aimed at general audiences captures the grim paradox. The missile's flight profile made it virtually impossible to intercept, but its offensive launches did not begin until September 1944, when Germany's position was already deteriorating. The same account notes more than 1,200 additional missiles fired over the following months and states that more than 2,700 Britons died due to rocket attacks. The emotional contrast sharpened as the program moved from the clean, purposeful spaces of Peenemünde into the subterranean reality of Mittelwerk. The Allies understood that Peenemünde was more than a test site. It was a doorway into a future where physics itself could be weaponized. After a British air raid on Peenemünde on August 17-18, 1943, German authorities accelerated the shift to protected underground production. What emerged near Nordhausen in the southern Harz Mountains with a secret factory carved into tunnels, an industrial cathedral built below the earth where air was bad, dust constant, and daylight a memory. The forced labor system that fed it became one of the most lethal chapters in the Nazi concentration camp network. The U.S. Holocaust Museum details how prisoners initially transferred from Buchenwald were housed in catastrophic conditions, at times sleeping on straw on bare rock inside tunnels as the system expanded. Registered deaths rose dramatically. One figure given is an increase from 5 deaths in September 1943 to 669 in January 1944. The same account notes transports of the gravely ill and dying raised the de facto death toll to nearly 6,000 by early April 1944, and evacuation deaths pushed the final Mittelbau system toll to over 20,000. This is where the myth of the secret weapon, so often narrated in terms of steel and ingenuity, reveals its true fuel: human beings treated as disposable components. The V2's ascent towards space travel, celebrated at Peenemünde, had an underside measured in starvation, disease, beatings, and exhausted bodies hauled through tunnels. The weapon's elegance in flight was purchased with ugliness on the ground. Even the factory's productivity, reaching cited rates like 600 to 700 V2 missiles per month by September 1944, reads differently when placed beside the conditions that produced it. The rocket was meant to symbolize German mastery of the future. In practice, it symbolized a state consuming its own moral substance to keep the illusion alive. And still, for many German soldiers and technicians, hope persisted, because hope was often the only ration not yet cut. A weapon that could cross the sky without interception felt like a correction to the war's injustices. But the experience of those handling the V2 in the field rarely resembled the triumphant imagery of propaganda. The rocket required specialized logistics, liquid oxygen, alcohol fuel, careful preparation, mobile launch equipment that had to survive Allied air reconnaissance, and fighter-bomber attacks. The launch crews lived under constant threat, striking quickly, moving constantly, watching the skies for aircraft that represented not just danger, but inevitability. The weapon could not be intercepted, but the men who launched it could be. The Reich was building the future while losing the present. In the Mediterranean, another German secret weapon offered a different kind of promise: precision. The Fritz X, also known as the Ruhrstahl X-1, was a guided, armor-piercing bomb based on the PC-1400 design and controlled by radio command with a joystick system, using spoilers on a cruciform tail. It was not a rocket, not a jet, but it carried something that felt equally revolutionary: the ability to steer a falling bomb toward a moving ship. Its first and most spectacular success came on September 9, 1943, when Dornier Do 217 aircraft used it to sink the Italian battleship Roma and damage the battleship Italia as they sailed to surrender to the Allies. The technical facts are stark. The Fritz X weighed about 1,570 kilograms, carried an armor-piercing warhead with roughly 320 kilograms of explosive, and used a Kahl-Strasberg radio link with manual command-to-line-of-sight guidance. On that day in September 1943, Roma took 2 hits in a near miss. Its magazines exploded, and 1,393 men died, including Admiral Carlo Bergamini. Italia was badly damaged, but managed to reach Tunisia. The weapon's achievement was real, and in a narrow tactical sense it was terrifying, a moment when steel and radio waves overcame the traditional defenses of armor and maneuver. Yet here too expectation collided with experience. Precision required conditions. The launching aircraft had to maintain a relatively steady course while the operator visually guided the bomb, an approach that made the bomber vulnerable to fighters and flak. And the Allies, learning rapidly, deployed countermeasures. Electronic jamming and improved air defenses made repeated successes far more difficult. The Fritz X foreshadowed the modern age of guided munitions, but it did not deliver Germany a decisive Mediterranean reversal. It was a glimpse of tomorrow, brief, brilliant, and ultimately swallowed by today's larger balance of air power and resources. Then there was the jet. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the aircraft that seemed to arrive from another era. Once airborne, it could exceed 850 kilometers per hour, over 530 miles per hour, roughly 150 kilometers per hour faster than any Allied fighter then operational in the European theater. It carried 4 30mm cannons, and later variants could mount underwing rockets designed to shred bomber formations. About 1,430 were built. It entered the operational world in 1944, late enough that its brilliance often reads like tragedy, a masterpiece arriving when the stage was already burning. For German fighter leaders, the Me-262 looked like restored agency, quality over quantity, speed over vulnerability. One striking line attributed to Adolf Galland captures this yearning for regained superiority: "I would rather have one Me-262 than 5 Me-109s. It is not merely a comment on performance. It is the voice of a service watching the sky fill with enemy bombers, feeling its older tools become obsolete, and grasping for a single machine that could make the air war feel winnable again." But the Me-262's lived wartime experience was shaped as much by politics and fuel as by aerodynamics. The same archival account, drawing on records like the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, details the aircraft's speed across altitudes, up to about 550 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, and endurance of roughly 50 to 90 minutes depending on conditions. It notes production beginning in March 1944, with small deliveries in April, and describes a pattern in mid-1944 where production emphasized bomber variants rather than fighters. It also records that it was not until August that the first fighter bombers were ready for action. In the world of secret weapons, the Me-262 was perhaps the clearest example of how a regime could possess technological genius and still misapply it because the ideology at the top demanded a specific kind of vengeance more than a sober assessment of operational necessity. The documentation of leadership interference reads like a slow constriction around the aircraft's potential. Hermann Goering insisted on terminology and role, pushing the Blitzbomber identity. Erhard Milch assured Hitler that the aircraft was being built as a fighter aircraft. None, my fear. The Me-262 is exclusively built as a fighter aircraft, only to collide with a political decision that treated the jet as an instrument of revenge against ground targets. Hitler's impatience with dissent hardens on the page. I don't wish to hear any more of this nonsense. I've had enough of it. This aircraft is a bomber, a Blitzbomber, my instrument of revenge. These are not tactical statements. They are ideological imperatives. The jet's speed was real, but speed alone could not outrun the internal fractures of decision-making in a dictatorship at war. For the pilots who eventually flew it in combat, the Me-262 offered exhalation mixed with constraint. It could hunt bombers with unprecedented closing speed. It could choose engagement and disengagement more freely than piston fighters. Yet it was also fragile in key ways. Early engines could be temperamental. Training for high-speed jet combat was limited. Fuel shortages worsened as synthetic plants were bombed and supply lines collapsed. Airfields became predictable targets, and Allied fighters learned that the jet's moments of vulnerability were not in the sky at full speed, but on approach and takeoff, when it could not yet wield its advantage. The secret weapon became a machine that demanded perfect conditions, exactly what Germany was losing. Even after the war, when the Me-262 could be evaluated without the pressure of collapsing infrastructure, its significance was clear. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown, who flew a captured Me-262 after the war, called it the most formidable aircraft of World War II, describing it as a quantum jump and noting that with its speed, you could conduct combat totally on your own terms. If you did not want to engage, you could go off and leave everyone standing. It is a technical compliment with an implicit lament. If such an aircraft had appeared earlier with fuel, pilots, and coherent strategy behind it, the air war might have been costlier for the Allies. But history does not reward conditional tenses. Across these three weapons, the V-2, the Fritz X, and the Me-262, Germany touched the outlines of post-war warfare: ballistic missiles, precision-guided munitions, jet combat. Yet the psychological promise of these systems to reverse the war's direction was larger than their strategic capacity. They were introduced into a Germany increasingly short of oil, time, and safe airspace. The Reich could still produce marvels, but it was producing them inside a shrinking envelope of possibility. The miracle was always a few months away. The decisive deployment was always about to begin. The enemy was always about to break. Meanwhile, rail lines were severed, cities burned, and front lines moved closer. And here, the story acquires a recurring symbol, small, almost banal, yet powerful in what it represents. Imagine, as spring turns into late war, a dented can of American coffee, powdered, bitter, abundant, passed from hand to hand among U.S. soldiers or sitting in a crate near a makeshift command post. It is not glamorous. It does not roar like a rocket or scream like a jet, but it is a quiet artifact of a different kind of power, a nation able to ship calories, comfort, and routine across an ocean while also producing aircraft, tanks, and ammunition in numbers that dwarfed Germany's strained output. That can, its label plain, its contents ordinary, becomes a metronome in the background of the secret weapons narrative. Germany's wonders were feats of engineering in a world of shortages. America's strength was the ability to make the extraordinaire feel routine. When American troops overran parts of the V-weapons production complex near the end of the war, they encountered a landscape where the secret weapon was no longer secret, only incomplete. One post-war account of the early US V-2 launches notes that almost exactly a year before the first American firing, U.S. troops had overrun the underground Mittelwerk V-weapons plant and in the process liberated several hundred very sick concentration camp prisoners in the adjacent camp. It also describes U.S. Army ordnance teams evacuating components for 100 V-2s and shipping them to the American Southwest to learn how to operate the world's first ballistic missile. The weapon that had been built as vengeance was now being catalogued as knowledge. The transformation was not only technical, it was ideological. In Germany, the V-2 had been framed as retribution, as terror repaid with terror. At Peenemünde, Hitler's own reaction, recorded in later summaries, could be cast as a lament for lost opportunity. "Why was it I could not believe in the success of your work? If we had had these rockets in 1939, we should never have had this war." In the United States, the captured V-2 would become part of a post-war arc that pointed toward exploration and strategic deterrence, yes, but also toward a more open relationship with technology, published research, institutional science, and a political culture that, for all its flaws, did not require secrecy to justify itself in the same way. The same missile could be either a closed fist or an outstretched hand, depending on the society directing it. That shift is captured in a single moment in the New Mexico desert. At 2:47 p.m. on Tuesday, April 16, 1946, a captured V-2 rose from White Sands Proving Ground. It failed. Its guidance system malfunctioned. A fin came off, and after reaching only about 3.4 miles in altitude, it crashed in the desert. The failure is important because it is honest. It is the opposite of propaganda certainty. It is experimentation in the open air, dangerous, imperfect, corrected by repetition rather than masked by slogans. Only weeks later, on May 10, 1946, another refurbished V-2 rose to an altitude of about 70 miles, 113 kilometers, crossing above the line now widely accepted as the threshold of space. It was, according to the same account, the first launch into space from the United States and by anyone except the Germans themselves, whose V-2s had routinely crossed that mark during wartime tests and operations. The desert sky swallowed the rocket's trail in the same way the Baltic sky once had. But the meaning had changed. Under one regime, space travel was invoked to sanctify a weapon. Under another, the same trajectory became a platform for science. Cosmic ray detectors, ultraviolet spectrographs, cameras that would eventually glimpse Earth from above. For German soldiers and technicians who had believed in the secret weapons, this was the final bitter contrast. They had expected their wonders to preserve the Reich, to hold back the bomber streams, to force a political settlement through fear. What they experienced, instead, was that the weapons arrived like sharp needles into a body already suffering systemic collapse. The Me-262 could outpace Allied fighters, but it could not conjure fuel from bombed refineries where trained pilots faster than the war consumed them. The Fritz X could sink a battleship under specific conditions, but it could not dominate a sea controlled by Allied air cover and adaptive countermeasures. The V-2 could fall on cities without warning, but it could not erase the map of advancing armies, and it could not repay the moral debt created by the manner of its production. Even the rhetoric surrounding these weapons reveals a shift in perception. Dornenberger's New Era line is genuinely visionary. It points beyond the war toward a wider human horizon. Yet the regime that funded the work framed it as retribution, terror, and restoration of dominance. The same tension appears in the Me-262 story. Guélin's emphasis on restoring superiority through performance. "We need quality of performance. I would rather have one Me-262 than 5 Me-109s," speaks to a professional attempting to solve a military problem, while Hitler's insistence on a Blitz bomber reveals a leader seeking emotional retribution more than operational logic. The secret weapons were not only machines, they were mirrors, reflecting the priorities and pathologies of the state that wielded them. And always in the background, the small symbol returns. the can of American coffee. In the late war world of Germany, food became thin, ersatz, rationed to the edge. Fuel became a strategic dream. Even time itself felt rationed, measured by air raid sirens and the distance to the next front. In the American war effort, the mundane persisted alongside the catastrophic. Standardized rations, mass logistics, spare parts, training cycles, the ability to rotate units and replace losses without dissolving into improvisation. This was not simply wealth, it was a kind of civic infrastructure, an organized abundance that could be mobilized without turning society into a tunnel. The coffee can becomes a quiet metaphor for democracy's material dimension, the capacity to sustain human beings while sustaining war, and then to turn that capacity back toward life when the fighting ends. The larger truth seen through these weapons is not that technology is irrelevant. The V2 opened a path toward the missile age. The Fritz X foreshadowed precision strike. The Me-262 announced the jet era. The truth is that technology amplifies the character of the system behind it. In a regime built on coercion and ideological vengeance, innovation becomes another instrument of domination, brilliant, terrifying, and morally hollowed. In a system with broader institutional capacity and a different relationship to legitimacy, captured technology can be redirected, still for power, still for security, but also for science, documentation, and eventually the shared imagery of a planet seen from above. In the end, the secret weapons did not save Nazi Germany. They did not reverse the Allied advance, and they did not shatter the industrial tide that rolled in from the United States and the Soviet Union. What they did instead was leave a complicated inheritance, a set of ideas and devices that would shape the second half of the 20th century, and a moral warning embedded in their origins. The V2's trail across the sky can be read as a bridge, as Dornberger suggested, but bridges do not choose where they lead. They carry the intentions of those who build them. And when one remembers the tunnels of Mittelwerk, where the air was poison and the death toll rose into the tens of thousands, the bridge's shadow becomes as historically important as its arc. So the final image is not only of rockets and jets, not only of guided bombs falling with unnatural certainty, it is also of ordinary objects that outlast the spectacle. A dented can of coffee, a crate stamped with inventory numbers, a desert launch pad under open sky. One world tried to manufacture destiny through secrecy, terror, and forced labor, and produced wonders that arrived too late, at too high a moral cost, in too narrow a strategic window. Another world, imperfect and conflicted, carried its power in the ability to produce not just weapons, but systems, food, training, logistics, research at scale, and then to convert even an enemy's weapon engines into a tool that could climb toward space and return with knowledge. Freedom and abundance are not the same thing, but in total war they become entangled. The weapons that promised German salvation revealed instead the brittleness of a state that demanded miracles while consuming its people. The American can of coffee, small, almost laughably humble beside a V2, speaks to a different kind of strength, not the thrill of a secret, but the endurance of an open system that can feed its soldiers, supply its factories, and still imagine a future where the sky is not only a route for vengeance, but a horizon for possibility.